I pray for the sermon today that you would give us just open hearts to hear your word, and we would have community with those around us. It's your name we pray.
All right, everybody, let's thank our praise team this morning. Good job. Great job. I was watching this medical drama on TV the other night, and they had this really sick and gross situation where this runner came into the hospital just having collapsed during a marathon. And it turns out that he had a head cold and he took too much of the wrong kind of medicine. Anyway, he collapsed and they brought him to the ER. And everything seemed like it was going fine until his kidneys started to fail. And then his legs started to fill with fluid. And he was going into some kind of cardiac situation. And so they brought the crash cart, it was code blue. And they just, boom, all these people just descend on his little medical area. And they started bringing him back to life. But one of the problems was his legs are swelling up bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, like they were going to pop. And so what they had to do, before they could even give him any anesthesia, they had to take a razor and they had to slit the inside of his leg open like this, from the inside of his thigh down to his ankle like this, and just all this stuff just goose just comes right out down both legs. And the dude is screaming, Some of y'all want to go into the medical field. You're like, yeah, yeah. I'm thankful for people like you. I also hope nothing like that ever happens to any of us, in real life. I was just thinking, how horrible would it be to have to go through some kind of surgery without any anesthesia? Now think about, 100 years ago, 200 years, how long have we had anesthesia? Think about what surgery would have been like before there was any kind of anesthesia. I'm thinking it would be painful. Are y'all with me on that? That would really be one of the most terrible things that could ever happen to you. And yet I think sometimes what happens to us is sometimes we try to anesthetize our hearts. Think about the comparison I'm trying to make for a second. So when we go through physical pain and it requires some kind of surgery, we're thankful for the anesthesia that will take the edge off that pain. But think about how we cope with emotional pain sometimes. Sometimes we just try to numb our hearts, almost like some kind of emotional anesthesia. And so today we are diving back into the life of Joseph for the last week. We're on week 5 in the life of Joseph, and it's sort of the dramatic ending and the dramatic conclusion to this story. But what you're going to notice here in today's story is he doesn't do that. He's going to feel every emotion, and he's going to feel it deeply. And the pain and the stuff that he had gone through in his early life, all that emotion is just going to come right back. It's going to come rushing back. It's going to well up in his life, and he's going to express it. He's not going to try to anesthetize himself, because here's the problem. You can't love God and you can't love other people with an anesthetized heart. You can't love God and you can't love other people with a numbness in your heart. Y'all see the problem? We try to use something to numb our hearts so we don't have to feel the pain, but then the downside of that is you don't actually feel the love either. So it's understandable. We go through some difficult times, and that's what Joseph went through. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn to the end of the book of Genesis. So we're in Genesis chapter 45 today. And I understand heartbreak, and some of you do too. You understand what it's like, and you know what it's like to try to ignore that pain, and you try to minimize the pain. You just want the pain to go away, so you try to distract yourself from it. Here's the thing about your teenage brain that you've probably already heard. You feel things more than you will later. In other words, just the way our chemistry works, we experience higher highs and lower lows emotionally when we're going through our teenage years. And so when you experience some kind of heartbreak, you feel it even worse sometimes. And so the temptation then is to anesthetize ourselves. But the problem, again, is that if you do that, if you learn that pattern and you learn that habit early on in your life, you're actually going to cut yourself off from loving God with your whole heart. And remember, Jesus said the greatest commandment, right? The greatest command is to do what? Love God with all your heart and soul and strength. And it's important to think about what that command means. It comes to us in the Old Testament, and there's a Hebrew word for heart. It's pronounced lev. And it's an important biblical concept because in the Hebrew understanding of that word, it's the place of your deepest thoughts. It's the place of your deepest desires. It's where you know and understand and believe that something is real in your heart. We still use the same phrase for the heart as sort of this metaphor for the deepest part of us. It's where you feel the deepest pain, joy, love, and fear in all the deepest ways. And so, in fact, this sometimes happens. I hear people say they want to go deeper with God. And when some people say that, I ask them, what do they mean? And oftentimes they mean they want to learn more about the Bible, which is good. It's good to learn more about the Bible, but that misses the deeper part of going deeper with God. Because sometimes we settle for this shallow, surfacey kind of relationship with God that's determined by how much you know of the Bible or how often you come to church. But really, if you want to go deeper with God, it's about your heart. It's about giving Him all that you have in your heart. The heart is the center of your life, and it's the core of who you are. So if you want to go deeper with God, it's about giving Him all that love. And you can't do that if your heart is anesthetized, just to help you get through emotional pain. So when you're a little kid, you were kind of oblivious to some of these things, but now that you're becoming young adults, you start to realize, no, there's some emotional pain that really sticks with you, and it's hard to get rid of. And so today, it's going to lead us back into the topic of forgiveness. Last week, we were talking about what it takes to forgive others, and today we're going to see another example of what that looks like in the life of Joseph and his brothers, because there's a barrier sometimes. If we are unable to receive forgiveness, it's really hard for us to extend forgiveness to others. We're going to see that today. So you have to look at what Joseph did. And what he did when he experienced all these bad things and traumatic things in his early life is he had to put it in a bigger perspective, and he had to see the bigger story of what God was doing through all that. And what he had to do was look at it in a way that maybe God looks at some of these things. And it takes a while maybe to understand God's perspective on the painful and difficult things that we go through. But God was using all this pain in his life in a way that he could have never imagined, in a way that he wouldn't really understand until later. So let's look at Genesis chapter 45. Now we're at the point in his life where he understands some of these things he's gone through. It says in chapter 45, verse 1, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself. He could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.'" He's like, "Get out! Everybody get out!" And so they're freaked out. At this point, Joseph is like second in command, only under Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he's basically in charge of everything, and he has all these servants working for him, and he has his brothers there standing in his presence, and he just tells all the people working for him to get out. And so there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and the Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not even able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. I mean, they're shocked and they're astonished. So let's back up in case you haven't been with us these last few weeks and you don't know what's going on. This is like the dramatic climax of the story right here where he reveals his true identity to his brothers who had sold him into slavery when he was 17 years old. Can you imagine that moment where instead of killing him, which is what they wanted to do because they were so jealous of their dad's love for him that they were going to kill him, but instead they're like, we could at least make money off of him if we sell him to these traffickers, and they're going to take him to this foreign country and do who knows what. We don't care. We just want to get rid of him. And so his cries and is pleading with them not to allow this to happen just fell on deaf ears. His cold-hearted brothers just watched him get led away in chains off to some foreign country. And so this was a part of their history, of their relationship. And at this point, the brothers, they have no idea who Joseph is. He just looks like this very important Egyptian. They had come from the land of Canaan to Egypt to buy grain because there was a massive famine throughout the land. And so this official, this very high important official, has basically told them, you guys can take grain back to your family in Canaan and all this stuff. So he's been very generous with them up to this point. However, there was still one more test that he was going to give these guys to see if they'd really changed over the last 20 years, or if they were the same cruel older brothers that they had been earlier in Joseph's life. And so what Joseph did was he set up his youngest brother, Benjamin, so that little Benjamin would be caught stealing. He had basically fed his brothers. He gave them sacks of grain and food to take back on their donkeys, and he said, okay, you guys go ahead and go. And then he sent one of his officials after the caravan while they're on their way back home to their homeland, and they said, hey, one of you guys has stolen a silver cup. And they're like, no, if one of us stole it, you can kill that brother, and then you can enslave the rest of us. And so they were so sure none of them had stolen anything. But Joseph had planted the silver cup in young Benjamin's bag. And so when they discovered that Benjamin was the thief, then he had to face the punishment and the penalty. And this is all from earlier in the story. Remember, Benjamin is now the most favored younger brother, just like Joseph had been. And so Joseph is going to get to watch the brothers and how they treat Benjamin. Are they just going to say, hey, Benjamin, too bad for you. You shouldn't have stolen the cup, so we'll let Dad know that you said, goodbye. And so they would say, hey, we're off the hook. Just take Benjamin. He stole it. Joseph is keeping an eye on what's going to happen and how they're going to respond and how they're going to react. And so the brothers knew that their youngest brother was about to be punished. But this is where Judah, one of the older brothers, shocks everyone. And this is what I was trying to explain last week when I basically had a stroke up here. I forgot what I was doing. I didn't have, because I got so lost. If you were here, I was like, I have no idea where this is in the Bible. But anyway, I found it later, so it is actually in the Bible. Judah, one of the older brothers, said, don't take him, take me. So what Joseph had said was, all right, I'm going to show you guys mercy. You can all go. Just leave Benjamin here. He, I think, probably wanted to protect Benjamin from these older brothers. He wanted Benjamin to be with him in Egypt and have this family relationship. He was his full brother, not half brother. And so he's like, leave Benjamin. But Judah's like, no, I can't. And Judah just begged Joseph, who is still in disguise at this point, take me instead. Don't take Benjamin. It would kill our dad. Well, the old Judah would never have even cared what would happen to Jacob, their dad. He would be like, if he cries a million tears, it serves him right for favoring the other younger brother. And so Judah has had an absolute change of heart at this point. And it shocks everyone, and he begs to be allowed to take his little brother Benjamin's place. And then Judah could not have proven more clearly how genuine his heart had changed. And so Joseph is seeing all this, and he's beginning to well up with emotion, which is where we are here at this point in chapter 45, where Joseph finally decides this is the moment where he is going to reveal his true identity. They think he's dead. They think Joseph is long gone, sold into slavery years ago. It never would have crossed their mind that the person in charge of this superpower, Egypt, is actually their very own brother who had been sold into slavery decades ago. And so this is the moment that he loses it emotionally. And if you look back at the passage, look again, it says, he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and the Pharaoh's household heard about it. They're like, hey, you can't believe how hard Joseph is crying. Joseph, imagine how this is freaking out his brothers. This is a very important person, a very high official in the kingdom, and he's just losing it. He's like ugly crying. You know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about? Ugly cry, it's like halfway before, like through a slow sneeze. Like, you can practice making this face if you want to. Just like, yeah, have you ever seen somebody like slow cry, like this, like messy cry? Joseph loses it, and most of the time, a grown person, a grown adult in public will hold it together at least for the sake of appearances. He absolutely loses it. He sent out his attendants, but they still could hear him really, really crying hard at this moment. Pick it up again in verse 3. It says, I'm Joseph. So the brothers are terrified, it says. They're terrified for several reasons. Number one, because of his face and how ugly crying is, but also because they are starting to realize, we're in big trouble. Like, he is this important, he is this much in charge of the entire nation of Egypt, and we are the ones who attempted to kill him at first, but then decided to sell him. Like, they know they're in big trouble. And so then Joseph says to his brothers, come over here, come close to me. They're pretty worried about this situation. Let me go ahead and read the story down to verse 15. Joseph says to the brothers, come over here, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, don't be distressed, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Listen to what Joseph is telling them. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Do you see how Joseph is keeping all this horrible trauma in perspective as part of God's bigger story to save lives? Verse 6, he says, for 2 years now there's been a famine in the land. And for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And so Joseph is saying, look, this is all a part of God's bigger plan to save you, to save our family. And then in verse 8, he says, so then, it was not actually you who sent me here, but God. That is an incredible statement for anyone to make who has been through serious pain. If you were to just put yourself and the pain you've been through up to this point in your life into this paragraph right here, and to be able to say, it was not you who did it, but it was God who did it, then that is really hard. That's so difficult to actually believe in your heart that God had a plan for the painful things that you have had to go through. It was not you who sent me here, but God. And he made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all Egypt. So now, hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all of Egypt. Come down to me and don't delay, and you will live in the region of Goshen, and you will be near me, and you and your children and your grandchildren and your flocks and your herds and all that you have, I will provide for you there. Because you know what? There's still another 5 years of this famine. And otherwise, if you don't come, you and your whole household and all who belong to you will become absolutely destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. He's just pouring out his heart right here. He's like, tell my father about all the honor accorded to me in Egypt and about everything you've seen, and bring my father down here quickly. And then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin, and he wept again. You see all this emotion just pouring out of him. He wept, and he kissed all his brothers, and he wept over them, and afterward his brothers, they talked with him. And so then the news is about to reach Pharaoh, all these things that have been going on. Here's the point that I want to make about this part of the story. Even though Joseph's forgiveness was very genuine, I mean, you can tell He's not setting them up at this point to surprise them with like some secret plan of revenge. No, this is very heartfelt. He loves his brothers. He's forgiven them completely. But the problem at this point is that the 10 brothers are still worried. Do y'all see that? Did y'all pick up on that? Like Joseph has 100% forgiven his brothers, but they're not so sure. And so the reconciliation in their brotherhood and their friendship, it can't happen. Not because of a lack of forgiveness. The forgiveness is there. You know what the barrier is? Did you notice and see what the barrier is? Notice, Joseph has forgiven them, and he's hooked them up with the best land in all of Egypt. This is like the king's special land. It's called the area of Goshen, and it was fertile, and it was easy to plant crops, and it would be a wonderful place to live. It'd be like their version of Texas. And so Goshen is like going to be the prime land, and it's absolutely preserved. And Joseph is like, bring Dad, bring your wives and your kids, and bring everybody over here and live in this awesome place. And so here's what ends up happening. They do. They go back to their homeland, and they have some big news for their dad. They're like, Dad, you are never, ever, ever going to believe what happened to us in Egypt. And so they break the news to him, and Jacob is extremely happy. They all move to Egypt. But the 10 brothers are still worried, you guys. Even after all this has happened, they're still worried that it's too good to be true. They worried that it was temporary. They worried that someday, even after they moved to the wonderful land of Goshen, that someday their dad was going to die. They started to think, they probably talked it over amongst themselves, and they said, hey, this is all going really well right now, but you know what? I'm a little worried because when Dad dies, when Jacob dies, maybe that's the moment Joseph is waiting to get us. The only reason he hasn't gotten us already is because he's scared of Dad. Like, he doesn't want to disappoint Dad. But when Dad dies, we're going to see what really happens. And so they're still worried, even after all this time, that Joseph is going to take his revenge. So let's skip ahead and see what happens in the final chapter. Go ahead and look at chapter 50. And we'll look at the very end of the book of Genesis. Chapter 50, beginning in verse 15. They're afraid of what Joseph might do to them. And it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. Yeah, that's right. 50, verse 15. Mm-hmm. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs that we did to him? That's incredible. After everything that Joseph has done to demonstrate his genuine forgiveness and love for them, they are still having a difficult time believing that he can truly forgive them. After what they did, they still feel that guilt. They still feel that shame. Even though Joseph has said, I forgive you, they can't quite forgive themselves for what they've done. And so they're thinking, there's no way he's really forgiven us. And so they're scared. In verse 16, they come up with this lie. I'm sure it's a lie. Look at it. Verse 16, so they sent word to Joseph saying, hey, your dad left these instructions before he died. Verse 17, this is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God, of your father. And when their message came to him, look at what Joseph does once again. Do you see how Joseph responded to this attempt? The brothers want to be safe from revenge, so they've come up with this story about how their dad demands that they be forgiven. Do you see how Joseph responds? It says Joseph wept. He wept. So what was it? What was it that got Joseph so moved emotionally at this point? The brothers are still worried that it's all too good to be true. It's all temporary. They're afraid of what Joseph is going to do now that their dad is dead. But notice again, they are super aware of their guilt. They have not recovered from their own past mistakes. Joseph had forgiven them, but they didn't trust it. It was like, no way. He doesn't really like us. He's going to get us. Can I just stop and say at this point, sometimes the biggest barrier between us and God is believing that we're actually forgiven. You know what I'm talking about? Sometimes the biggest barrier between your ability to receive the love of God and to believe that His love for you is real is simply that you don't think you're very lovable. You think you've already gone too far. That we tend to condemn ourselves, right? We tend to be our own worst critic. And we think, how could I ever think what I think and do what I've done or say what I said? And so we tend to condemn ourselves, and we believe Satan's lie that you have used up all the grace that God has for you. Like, there's no way God could still have that much grace for you. After all the things that you've done and said, somehow God is still going to love you. He actually sees right into your mind, and God knows the thoughts that you have about the other people in this room or at school, on your team, about your parents. He knows all that stuff. And so you start to think, there's no way. Like, I've used up all the grace God has for me. I've already gone too far. I'm not a person that God could love. And that becomes one of the biggest barriers, is actually believing that we're forgiven. Well, as you can see at the end of verse 17, Joseph has more emotion pouring out of him. And what's that emotion about? Why is he so moved? Why is he crying? It's because he's hurting for them. Joseph is hurting for them. This is an incredible display of his godliness. Like, this is how God is. Joseph is the one who had been wounded, but Joseph is actually moved with compassion because they can't receive the forgiveness that he wants to give them. They can't have the relationship with him that he wants to have. That's incredible. So he is actually weeping over their fear of him. I wonder if that's how God is with us. I wonder when we are in that headspace where we can't actually trust the love of God, I wonder if God is like sad about that. And he just wants you to experience his love for you, but you're kind of like, no, I'm not worthy of that love. And so he's just like sad. Look at verse 18. His brothers then came and they threw themselves down in front of him, and they said, we're your slaves. We are your slaves. They're like, don't kill us. They're so convinced that the forgiveness that has been demonstrated so far has all just been a lie, just some kind of a mask for what Joseph really was going to do. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And so then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you two answers to the question of how to help other people when they are struggling, when they're going through emotional pain and difficulty. But it has to do, the first thing has to do with what you have to do as a prerequisite. Before you can really help someone else, it's kind of like when you're on an airplane and they tell you if you go through turbulence and the oxygen's drop down, what do they tell you to do first before you help somebody else next to you? You got to put it on. You got to put the oxygen mask on yourself so you can breathe. So here's what you have to do before you can really help somebody else when they're going through some pain and some struggles and some difficulties. The first thing is this: you can't anesthetize your oon heart. Remember I started off talking about that? You can't anesthetize your own heart. Joseph is vulnerable. You see it over and over and over again through this story. Like, he actually is able to feel deep hurt. And if you just anesthetize your heart and make it numb so that you don't ever feel any hurt anymore, and you think, oh man, I figured out how to hack the system. I'll never have to go through a heartbreak again because I'm never going to feel anything. It's like that famous film, about the woman who has the control over the power of ice and winter, and she creates this palace of ice way up high on the mountain. I forget the name of it. Good. What?
Frozen.
Nope, that's not it. Not Frozen. Right. Anyway, so you don't want to anesthetize your own heart, and Joseph is a great example because he doesn't do that. He's vulnerable, and so when you're speaking to what? I'm not pretty sure it wasn't Frozen. Anyway,
I said it was a snow queen.
Anyway, let's just move on. Agree to disagree. Okay, so you can't anesthetize your own heart if you're going to help other people, and so speaking to someone else's heart means you have to open up your own heart. Y'all see that? And that's what Joseph does. As a side note, the middle school mindset is to always be worried about what other people around you think about you, right? You remember those days way back in middle school when you were so concerned about your appearance and fitting in and being cool. Now that you're in high school, you don't worry about that anymore. But middle school sometimes can be such a devastatingly difficult time because you get hit with all this social awareness. You're like, oh, everybody likes that person. Not everybody likes me as much. Maybe I need to compare myself to that person that everybody else seems to like. And so here's my point. A lot of times we get so hurt just going through the normal stages of adolescence where we're so worried all the time about comparing ourselves and not measuring up that we have to do something to our own heart to stop feeling all that pain. So you have to medicate it somehow. You can distract yourself from it. You have to just do something so that you don't hurt so much inside all the time by feeling inadequate. And when you do that, I'm telling you, you're anesthetizing it, and you won't be able to actually experience the love of God and be able to share that with other people. So the number one way that you can help other people when they're going through pain and struggles and difficulties is actually have a heart that's open. And so you can be vulnerable and speak on that heart level. Here's the second thing, right? How do you help other people going through struggles? Understand the bigger story. Joseph gets this better than anybody I've ever seen. He understands the bigger story. Joseph actually shares God's truth about the bigger story. This entire story of Joseph has the fingerprints of Jesus all over it. Like Jesus is just shining like a big, bright star in the sky, like right behind this entire story the whole time. Even in the story of Judah, the tribe that Jesus actually comes from later, the Lion of Judah is the nickname for Jesus. And so he is actually from the brother's tribe, the brother who stepped in and took the penalty on behalf of his little brother Benjamin. Is that ringing any bells? So this whole thing is just being orchestrated to point back to Jesus. And so for us to understand the bigger story and the bigger truth when we're going through our individual pain, listen, your little story is important to you because it's your story, but your little story fits into the much bigger story of what God's doing. And so if you're able to actually see the big picture and understand God's perspective on things, you will actually be able to share that with other people and help them make sense of the pain that they're going through at the time. It's temporary, and God has a purpose in all of that. So Joseph is understanding his own suffering, and that's what allowed him to heal. And although people do evil, God turns evil around and uses it as a part of his salvation plan. Again, there's no greater example than the death of Jesus on the cross where people do evil, but God intends it for good. The cross is a perfect example of that. And so when people do evil, God can actually take that and turn it and use it for something good. There's a passage in Corinthians that says, we are able to comfort others with the comfort we ourselves have received when we have gone through similar struggles and painful things. And so I saw that firsthand when we have some good friends whose son took his own life when the son was in 8th grade. And I was the youth pastor at the time. The 8th grade young man was in our youth group. And I was there at the home on the night when it happened. The parents were away at dinner, and I received a call sometime close to midnight. And so I drove over to the home, and there were police cars out front because it's treated as a crime scene. A lot of the friends had found out at that point and had wanted to come over and see the family and just, I don't know, pray for them, or just, I don't know. A lot of the friends came, but the police wouldn't let them near the house. And so they were there, kind of parked, and the families were there, and they were all crying. And so when I arrived, I couldn't stay with them very long because I needed to go inside and see how I could help. And I remember the pain of that night, a searing, deep kind of pain that just never leaves. If you've ever known of someone who has taken their life, it leaves a trail of just trauma for everybody involved. It's one of the most painful things that can happen in our world, I think, in a lot of ways. But especially the parents and the brothers of the boy who took his life. And as I watched them walk through their recovery process, which took months and years, and you could say is still happening to this day, the one thing that the mom has often said is, number one, you only know what someone is willing to tell you. And so they didn't know that their son was experiencing all these feelings, and these struggles, and these painful things, and these thoughts in his head, because he kept it all inside, number one. And number two, they recognized later, it took time to get here, but they recognized that these things, this pain that they had been through, enabled them to speak into the lives of other people who would go through similar struggles and pain as well. And in our experience with mutual friends, sadly, they did have the opportunity to minister to others later who also lost people to suicide. So even in that most extreme kind of heartbreaking scenario, you can see how God can take something so sad and so soul-crushing and still even turn that situation into something that can be used to comfort others who are going through difficulty and pain. So here's my couple of questions for you to think about today. With the last 15 minutes of our class time, I would love it if you would turn to the people around you, as we've done in the last few weeks, and find a group of people to discuss a couple of these questions. First question is this. Who is someone you know who's going through emotional pain? You don't have to say their name if it's confidential. It's fine. It's more of an opportunity for you to talk about how you might be able to bless them or step toward them and help them with some kind of comfort, as we were talking about in the way that Joseph was comforting his brothers. And then the second question is this. Do you struggle with believing that God is forgiving you? Do you struggle with that? Is there a barrier between you and your relationship with God because it's so difficult for you to believe that He is actually forgiven you? Past sins, present sins, and future sins. Is that difficult for you? You can talk about why or why not in those discussion groups. Let me go ahead and pray for us, and then you can have a time to discuss that in your circles, and then in about 15 minutes we'll dismiss, all right? So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we recognize that we are in a fallen world where tragedy happens, and there's no way to just skate through life without experiencing pain. And this story
of Joseph paints a very clear picture of how our pain fits in to a bigger story, and how you take things that are even intended to harm us and that are evil, but God, you turn it towards something good, just like Christ on the cross was treated in an evil way, and yet it was all part of your plan to bring salvation to others. And I pray that you would help us understand when we're going through pain and difficulties that there is a bigger plan for that. It doesn't make it easy, so thank you for walking with us through those difficulties. Thank you for surrounding us with people who love us and care about us. And I pray, God, that if anyone here today is struggling with suicidal thoughts or difficulties that they're holding inside, they think nobody else understands, that they would share that with someone they trust, God, and get the help that they need. And I thank you, God, for guiding us toward truth, and I thank you for allowing us to feel the depths of pain that you feel, and we can connect with you and relate to you in that way as well. So I pray, God, for everyone this week, that they'll continue to look to you, and that you'll bless them. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, go ahead and discuss in your groups, and then you'll be dismissed.